You're listening to Maneuvering Mondays, a podcast about transforming work culture. In this first part of the episode, we follow the fictional story of Marie, who's an HR manager in the edtech company Zebra Apps, as she maneuvers the challenges of transforming their work culture.
After taking off her coat and docking her laptop, Marie went to the copy room to get an A3 piece of paper. She put it down on her desk and folded it 3 times. She looked at her watch. It was 8:45. She remembered that she had a coaching session with their new VP of Sales at 9. She put the paper away and headed down to the meeting room area. It was 9:10 and Marie had already drunk her first cup of coffee and had time to get a refill. There was still no sign of Jacques, the VP of Sales. She decided to wait another 5 minutes and then give him a call. Jacques was relatively new at Zebra Apps. All new executives had to attend mandatory monthly coaching with Marie and one of her employees. Marie had worked hard to make this policy stick. Originally, it had been Natalie's idea, but her support seemed to be subject to influence by her leadership team, who found it was a waste of time. Especially Jacques. Perhaps only Jacques. He had joined Zebra Apps about a year ago to build the commercial side of the business. He was the first sales executive they had ever had. Prior to him, all sales were done to existing clients or through positive references. But after Aslo showed promise for scale, the board had decided that Zebra needed to professionalize the sales side. This might have something to do with how the composition of the board had changed after they brought in new investors to scale Aslo. Jacques had been the VP of Sales at Convo Systems for about 2 years before joining Zebra. Prior to that, he had been a business development director at a large software company. He had all the right qualifications to fill the position, but he was not well liked by the engineering teams. Not even by Jenny, who had started after Jacques had joined. She had never experienced the pre-commercial Zebra, making it clear that it was Jacques and not the commercial focus that bothered Jenny. Marie heard someone making coffee in the kitchenette. She heard Jacques' voice speaking on the phone. It was 9:15. The coffee machine finished brewing. "Let me just check if she's still here," he said, and she could hear his footsteps approaching the conference room. He peeped through the door, waved at Marie, and pointed to his phone. Marie nodded at him. He started walking back to the kitchen area. "Jesus, she is still in there," she heard him say on the phone. "Who sits around and waits for 15 minutes? Marie felt her blood rushing to her face. "Yeah, these types of people have nothing better to do," he said after a period of silence on the phone. "Well, I've got to go. Last time I didn't show up to a session, Natalie was pissed," he said. Marie didn't hear any footsteps approaching just yet. Now he was just standing there in the kitchen. Marie had gone from flushed to angry, but in her anger, she thought about the post she had read on LinkedIn. "I wonder what game this guy is playing," she thought to herself. She chuckled. "The avoidance game," she thought. "He is trying to close his eyes and pretend that she doesn't exist, like a child hiding from her parents when it's time to put the toys away." Marie got up from her chair and went straight to the kitchenette. Jacques was scrolling on his phone and looked up at her in surprise. "This is the last time you are late," Marie said, looking him straight in the eyes. His jaw dropped ever so slightly, but he quickly shut it. "I have better things to do than sit around talking about my feelings," he said. "I don't care about your feelings," Marie said. Jacques said nothing. Marie counted to 15 in her head to not break the silence too soon. "Then why do you want me to spend an hour of my time every month," he said, "if you don't even care about my feelings?" "Because this is not about you," she said. "This is about creating a leadership team in our organization that is capable of running this company." He huffed. "I was perfectly capable of running sales at Convo Systems without spending time with HR," he said. "Were you capable, Jacques?" Marie said, and raised her eyebrows. His face started to turn red. "What are you implying, Marie?" he said, taking a step forwards towards her. Marie took a deep breath. Finally, there was an opening to start the real conversation. It doesn't matter how capable you are individually in the leadership team. It takes self-reflection and emotional maturity to be part of a team that pulls the organization in the same direction, she said. And we meet once a month so I can help you develop those skills. Are you saying I am emotionally immature? He asked with a neutral face. You have been hiding from me in the kitchen for the past 5 minutes, she said with a smile. He smiled back. Okay, he said, picking up his coffee cup and heading to the conference room. After spending an hour and a half with Jacques, Marie threw herself down in her office chair and put her notebook down next to her computer. There was a tiny crack in Jacques' tough exterior, and Marie felt that he had a few realizations during their conversation. But getting to them had taken all of Marie's mental prowess. She knew how important it was to develop the people in the leadership team for the success of the company. But this was too much. She needed support. Natalie and Mark had already shown that they did not intend to provide it. In fact, Mark was bent on undermining whatever success she had. She opened her calendar application and folded out the calendar of her entire team. She found a 1-hour free slot the following day and sent out an invite. Dear team, next Wednesday we are presenting a culture program that will help us increase our retention rate. I would like your thoughts on what the content of this program could be. Bring your favorite marker and post-it color of choice. Kind regards, Marie. Sending the invitation made her shoulders lower. She stretched her arms over her head and her upper back cracked. Then she turned her attention to her inbox. Someone knocked on the frame of Marie's door and jolted her out of an email from a vendor providing project management services to the customer success team. It was Eric, the most senior member of her team. Hey, Marie, he said. Hey, Eric, she said. What's with this project management course? I hear that the ratings were lower than usual. Eric walked in and sat down in her armchair. He sat up straight, folding his legs underneath him. I think you need a break, he said. Marie looked at him and smiled, but said nothing. He looked back and shifted in his seat. Joe has a handle on the project management course, he said. She's finding a new vendor. Marie realized that he felt uneasy by her silence. I am sure Joe has it under control, she said. You hired her because she was an external project management trainer before joining us, he said, and sat back in his seat. Marie smiled and thought back to how pleased she was to read Joe's application among the long list of candidates in the recruitment system. Joe knew all the tricks and excuses these training companies could come up with. In fact, she had wanted to become an internal trainer to focus on doing a good job rather than finding excuses for bad performance. Then she looked at Eric. He was looking at her face as if trying to read a foreign language. I was quiet because you are right, she said. I need a break. He smiled, relieved. Let's go get lunch, he said. Marie looked at her clock. It was 11 o'clock. Have lunch during lunchtime, she said. Outrageous. They both laughed, and Marie got up from her chair to join Eric. As they walked down the stairs to the canteen, they joined the flow of what seemed like the whole company going to lunch at once. Marie had forgotten how it felt to be part of the lunch crowd. Somehow, she always had a fire to put out during lunchtime. Eric held the door open to the canteen for her, and she smiled at him. Some men of his generation managed to blend gallantry with equal treatment of women. They got in line to sanitize their hands with ethanol, then took a plate each from the stack of plates. Then they followed the crowd clockwise around the buffet table. Marie was amazed by the amount of options there were on the table. 3 different mixed salads, 8 additional types of vegetables, croutons and dressings, 2 hot dishes, and 2 types of bread. This kind of selection was not available in the late afternoon. As she was filling up her plate, she noticed the chef was springing in and out of the line, piling onto a plate. He saw Marie and suddenly stopped. Marie! He exclaimed. Chef, she said. I'm putting aside a plate for you, he said. Marie looked down at her own plate, not knowing exactly how to react. She had appreciated this gesture last week, but suddenly she couldn't quite read why the chef was doing her such a favor. She looked up. The chef was smiling with his mouth, but also had a sparkle in his eyes. Marie stepped out of the line after realizing that her sudden halt was creating a traffic jam around the buffet table. The chef walked over to her. Let's see what you've picked out, he said, looking at her plate. Bread, lasagna, all 3 salads, he said, and looked up at her. I knew you were a good eater. He then showed her what he was putting aside for her. Bread, lasagna, and all 3 salads, plus cheese cubes on top of all 3 salads. Well, what do you know, Marie said. He put a hand on her shoulder. I am glad you are finally having a proper lunch, he said. She looked at him, still trying to understand where this care came from. He leaned forward, almost whispering in her ear. And my name is Joseph, he said, not Chef. He then smiled again and took his version of Marie's plate back to the kitchen with him. Marie went back in line, circling around the buffet table. She stopped at the bowl of cheese cubes and poured them over all 3 of her salads. Looking around, she saw that Eric had already sat down at a long table. She went across the room to sit next to him. As Marie was sitting down, Andrea sat down across from her. Marie noticed that Willie was sitting next to Eric. Hey, Marie, Andrea said. Her voice sounded lighter now, and she was dressed in black pumps, black slacks, and a black turtleneck. Her hair was about shoulder length, braided into a French braid. Hey, Andrea, Marie said. It feels like I haven't seen you in forever, Andrea said. Then she looked straight into Marie's eyes. It is really good to see you, she said. Marie smiled. Eric made sure that I made lunch today, Marie said, and puffed Eric gently with her elbow. Eric was deep in conversation with Willie, but looked at Marie briefly and smiled, turning back to Willie. Good colleagues are golden, Andrea said, then leaned in across the table. Speaking of colleagues, Andrea said in a hushed voice, Anne called me on Saturday. Oh, Marie said, her head suddenly racing back to her conversation with Anne. Her heart started pumping faster. Had she said too much? Anne had not known about Andrea's transition, meaning that Marie was the one to tell her. Yeah, it was hilarious, Andrea continued. Someone had obviously told Anne about my situation, and she wanted to show her support. Hilarious? Marie repeated as she felt her hairs rise on her arms. She wouldn't say my name or any pronoun, Andrea said. You know, hey, you, how are you doing? Anything new? That kind of stuff. Andrea laughed a bubbly laugh and shook her head. I let her suffer for a couple minutes, then told her all about it, Andrea said. Marie laughed a forced laugh and stroked her left arm with her right hand to get it to calm down. How is that for you? Marie asked. I was really happy that she called, Andrea said. For everyone here, it has been easy to follow my transition, but I forget about all the people who had left right before anything happened on the outside. She gestured in circles around her chest area. Yeah, Marie said. I was thinking more about the business case situation. Remember? The one about the spare capacity of the data center? Andrea looked at her. Now Marie was the one to lean in across the table. When I found you in the bathroom, she almost whispered. Andrea smiled. That was a tough week, Andrea said. I had just upped my dose of hormones and was adjusting. Marie looked at her, confused. So you were not upset about the business case? Marie asked. I was upset about the business case, Andrea said firmly. Upset that we were making a business case for selling the spare capacity of the data center when we could have donated it to the displaced children and teachers from Ukraine, and broken even cost-wise from donations. Marie felt her world turning upside down. In this story, somehow Anne and Simon had been the villains in her mind for putting Andrea in a difficult situation in the middle of a difficult circumstance. Now, she was slowly realizing that Andrea was not a victim, and that Anne and Simon were not villains. But if Marie no longer was the hero in the story, what was she then? It was nice to speak to her. Andrea's voice broke through Marie's thoughts. I miss her. I met with her last Friday, Marie said, surprising herself. Andrea looked at her and smiled. Yeah, Anne mentioned that, Andrea said. Quite a heated debate as far as I can tell. What gave you that idea? Marie asked, trying to sound ironic but not quite pulling it off. Anne didn't say anything except that you showed up early to your appointment, Andrea said, and knowing Anne, that would throw her off. She likes to prepare. We were both half an hour early, Marie said, raising her eyebrows. She can be intense, I know, Andrea said, but she always managed to get the right kind of assignment for the right person at the right time. Like the business case you were working on, Marie said, not even trying to stop herself. That came straight from Natalie, Andrea said, looking Marie in the eyes. Nothing Anne could have done about that. Why did the interest in the business case suddenly disappear anyway? It did not make it onto the leadership agenda, Marie said, having a hard time holding back a smile. Andrea looked at her seriously. I see, she said hesitantly. Willie got up to bust his tray. You know, we still have spare capacity in the data center, Willie said. Those salesmen aren't filling the orders as they promised. Such a waste. He walked over to the recycling area. I wonder if the donors would still be willing to support rolling out Aslo to Ukrainian refugees, Andrea said, mostly to herself. I don't know how relevant that would be anymore, Marie said. In my daughter's kindergarten, they are distributing the Ukrainian children in the regular circles now. The war is dragging on longer than anyone expected, Eric said, now turning his body towards Marie and Andrea. The refugees will start integrating into their new host countries and their school systems. So we still have spare capacity in the data center, and we have wasted our chance to contribute to a pressing need, Andrea said. What happened to children's brains are not for commercial gain? She got up and picked up her tray. You know, sometimes I don't recognize this company anymore, Andrea said, and walked away. Eric and Marie were the only people remaining at their table. Marie looked down at her plate. She had taken a couple of bites of her lasagna, but her salads were mostly untouched. This is why I started coming down later for lunch, Marie said. I never get any eating done during lunchtime. Eric looked at her plate. We still have a couple minutes, he said. She looked at him, wondering why he was being so kind to her today. Then she dug into her salads. They sat in silence for a couple minutes while Marie chewed. The cheese was a really nice addition to her salads. Joseph's idea to add cheese had been really great. It's as if he knows my palate better than I know it myself, Marie thought to herself. Suddenly it struck her. Where does it come from originally? She asked Eric. What does? He asked. Children's brains are not for commercial gain, she said. Jason always ended his presentation with that, he said. But where did Jason get it from? She asked. Eric thought for a couple seconds. I think it might come from the mission statement that Natalie wrote when she founded the company, Eric said. Marie raised her eyebrows. Really? She said, surprised. It's not on our website anymore, but I think it is still on the company drive, Eric said. Marie put her knife and fork down on her plate on top of the unfinished lasagna and stood up. Let's find out, she said. On the way up the stairs from the canteen, Marie spotted Jason walking down the stairs. It was his last week with Zebra. Hey, Jason, Marie called out. He looked at her, but quickly looked down. Hey, Marie, he said. Hey, Eric. Jason, you might know this. Marie and I were just talking about where the phrase you always used in your presentations, children's brains are not for commercial gain, comes from? Eric asked. Jason looked up and into the distance. It was something Natalie said during my job interview, he said. It was the reason that I joined Zebra to begin with. Marie looked into the same distance that Jason was looking at. So it does come from Natalie, Marie said. Jason now looked at her. Yeah, you can't really tell anymore, he said. Thanks, Eric said, putting a hand on Jason's shoulder. Sure, Jason said, and headed down to the canteen. Marie and Eric walked up to their floor. Eric opened the door, intending to hold it open for Marie. Instead, the door bumped into something on the other side, only opening a sliver. What? Eric said. Just a minute, someone yelled on the other side of the door. Eric shrugged his shoulders at Marie. Should we take the elevator instead? Marie asked. Clear, the voice on the other side shouted. Eric opened the door without obstruction this time. They both walked through. On the right side of the stair door, right next to Mark's office, workers were installing a fridge with a glass door. "What in the..." Marie said. Mark came out of his office. "Nice, huh?" he said. "What is this for?" Eric asked. "It's a soda fridge," Mark said. "We will install one on each floor." Marie's eyes widened in disbelief. "Thanks to Marie's research, we now know that this is a key parameter that differentiates us from our competitors," Mark continued, "so we are closing the gap." Mark crossed his arms and smiled from ear to ear. Eric and Marie exchanged glances. "And Natalie approved this?" Marie asked. "Of course," Mark said, waving his hand as if he was brushing Marie's question away. "Mark, do you really believe that soda is going to make a difference? That people will stay because they have access to free soda?" Eric asked, rephrasing himself. Marie looked at him, admiring his courage. "At least we can say that we listened to what employees wanted and did something about it," Mark said, and went back to his office. Eric shook his head. Marie shrugged her shoulders. "Thank you for taking me to lunch," she said, and put a hand on Eric's shoulder. "Anytime," he said, and headed back to his desk in the open space area of the floor. Marie returned to her office. She closed the door. Then she paced back and forth a couple of times, walking parallel to her desk from her armchair to the whiteboard. "Free soda," she scoffed. "He's not even trying to solve the problem," she thought to herself. "He's just trying to make it look like he is doing something, covering his ass." She shook a fist at the ceiling. Suddenly aware of her gesture, she put her hand in her blazer pocket, as if containing it would manage her anger. Doesn't he see how comical this is? Trying to bribe highly intelligent and sought-after professionals with sugary drinks? She stopped and faced her desk. Madness, she thought. Useless ripples in the air. Busy work. Who in the hell will maintain these fridges? Who will fill them? Where will they store stocks of soda? She then took a deep breath, took her hand out of her pocket, and shook her arms and torso as if to shake off Mark's stupidity. She noticed the A3 paper that she had folded 3 times in the morning. "Just focus on what you can control," she said to herself out loud, and unfolded the sheet. During her time at BCG, Marie was frustrated with being thrown at multiple assignments at a time without being able to get in depth with any one of them. As a coping mechanism, she had developed the Task Ignition Canvas, which helped her quickly understand any new assignment. She developed a reputation for being a fast learner, and ironically got thrown into even more assignments at a time as a result. She had not used it before in Zebra apps. Usually, she would be the one to define and push any work that needed to be done. No one had any opinions on what development HR was supposed to do. Now she felt like a consultant again, being thrown into a client assignment without any expectation or context, but on a tight deadline. She folded the sheet on the opposite side 1/3 of the way. On the top third of the paper, she wrote people. On the column below to the right, she wrote process. In the middle column, she wrote tasks, and on the left column, she wrote questions. She started brainstorming on the people part. Who am I doing this for? Which problem do they have? How can I solve it? Why is it important for me to solve their problem? Who else is impacted by this problem? Who else is interested in solving this problem? Marie thought for a minute and started writing. I am interested in getting to the bottom of the retention problem, but Mark is interested in signaling that HR is doing something about the retention problem. I don't care about that. I think that Natalie is also interested in solving the retention problem itself, and so is the board. We are not going to achieve our goals of becoming the preferred remote edtech provider in the world if we keep losing the people that have built Oslo. Interesting, she thought to herself. I might have allies in the board of directors. She kept writing. I want Oslo to succeed. It is a flexible, secure, and cost-effective solution for both educators and children. It should take the lead in the market. It cannot reach its potential unless all departments in Zebra pull in the same direction. She looked up. Why aren't we pulling in the same direction? She thought. She looked at her whiteboard. Her notes from last week were still there, with the word culture circled. She thought back to her conversation with Anne and how she had tried to explain the difference between an ensemble and a team. Perhaps some good could come out of a culture program, she thought to herself. She looked out into the middle distance in the direction of her door. Her eyes focused on Jason, who was walking past her door holding his laptop and looking through the glass next to her door to see if she was in. She waved at him to come in. He opened the door. "Hey, Marie," Jason said. "Come on in," Marie said, relieved to be distracted. He pointed back into the hallway. "Are you planning to sell fish as a side gig?" he asked. Marie raised one eyebrow and opened her mouth slightly. Jason smiled. "What's with the big fridge?" he asked. Marie couldn't keep a thundering laugh back. "It's a soda fridge," she answered after a couple seconds, wiping away a tear. Jason looked at her. "For real?" he said. Marie nodded as she laughed. Jason shook his head and sat down in the armchair. Marie finally stopped laughing. "I looked through my email," he said, "and found the company presentation that Natalie showed me when I met her during my interviews." "Oh?" Marie said, not quite following. "That's where it's from," he said. "Children's brains are not for commercial gain." Marie's face lit up. "So you have it?" she asked. Jason opened his laptop and turned it around so Marie could see the screen. There it was, the onboarding presentation that Natalie used to do for all employees before she had delegated it to Mark, who had since delegated it to Marie. The slide was simple, with their zebra stripes faded in the background, a headline saying, "Our core beliefs," and just a single quote in bright green text box. "Children's brains are not for commercial gain." Marie felt a wave of hope wash over her. If Natalie was the originator of these words, then she must still believe in them, deep down, perhaps way down. She had sent it to me after my interview because I had asked so many questions about how it would feel to work for Zebra, he said. This presentation is what convinced me to join in the first place. Marie was taking it in. Layout-wise, I suggested improvements in my first week. He smiled. Marie smiled back. Jason had redone their whole corporate identity, killing off the green but keeping the zebra stripes. Jason's smile faded. Perhaps if I hadn't suggested the edits, the presentation would still be in circulation, he said. Marie looked in his eyes, but Jason looked away. What else does it say? Marie asked. Jason scrolled through. There was a slide about the founding of Zebra by Natalie and Richard, Natalie being an educator and Richard being a technologist. Richard was no longer with the company. He had left before Marie joined, and she did not quite know what went down between him and Natalie. There was a slide about what Zebra Apps did. This was before Aslo. Back then, they custom-built solutions for individual clients. This was before they had built their own data center and moved to this building. Then, there was a slide showing the organization of Zebra Apps. Natalie was at the top, the board of directors in a box to the right. HR, finance, and facilities on the left, and the developer teams in two boxes categorized as front-end and back-end. No managers, just the individual developers. The front-end box was relatively empty, which is why they were looking to hire someone with Jason's user experience design skill set. Remember when we all had to answer the phone when customers would call us? Jason said. We complained so much that Natalie had started hiring customer excellence teams. Marie nodded. I was the one to argue that developers' time was better spent developing, Marie said, and that specialization was a natural part of commercial expansion. Maybe if we were still answering calls from clients, we could have maintained our organic growth, Jason said, and would not need to hire salespeople. Scaling is hard on all companies, Marie said, not sure who she was defending. Sometimes I feel guilty, though, for not knowing how good we had it, Jason said, and changed slides. Marie felt bad for Jason. He clearly felt guilty for somehow contributing to the changes in the company, but somehow she could not find it in herself to console him, even though he was being vulnerable with her. After all, he was leaving Zebra. There was the Our Core Beliefs slide again. Jason changed the slide one more time. The headline still said Our Core Beliefs, this time detailing Zebra's values. Marie sat up in her chair. Wait a minute, she said. There they were, Zebra Apps values as Natalie and Richard had intended them, on the same background of zebra stripes, this time in a bright pink box. Curiosity, collaboration, courage, commitment. That's it, Marie said. Jason looked at her. Marie looked at him, realizing he did not have a chance to understand why she was excited about this slide in particular. Natalie has asked me to initiate a culture program, she explained. I didn't realize that we had already defined zebra values. Jason nodded. I'll send you this presentation, he said. He turned his laptop around and sent an email to Marie with the slide deck attached. Marie's phone dinged as she received the email. Not looking up, Jason commented, It is weird to me that HR doesn't know the company's values. He looked up. No offense. Marie smiled half a smile. You know what? She said. I completely agree. After Jason left her office, Marie thought about how these well-meaning values had disappeared from their onboarding presentation. They were not on the deck that Mark had shared with her when he asked her to take over the employee onboarding program. Had he been the one to remove them? Or had they never made it to Mark when Natalie handed the responsibility over to him? Had it really been Jason's rebranding that had removed the values? She printed the deck that Jason had sent her and walked to the printer room to pick them up. On the way back, she saw Joseph stocking the new fridge with soda from a trolley full of soda boxes. Is this your job now? Marie asked. Joseph looked at her and smiled. Marie! He exclaimed. Marie was suddenly embarrassed that she might have come off aggressive. You are one of the best chefs I've ever met, Marie explained. We must have someone else employed who can stock fridges. His smile widened. The kitchen is short-staffed, Joseph said. Among all of my team members, I am the most expendable. He laughed. What? Marie said. You make the kitchen run. I'm not the one doing the cooking, he replied, and right now, I am not the one doing the dishes after lunch. Marie looked at him. He kept stocking the fridge as she just stood there holding her copies. Suddenly, she had a realization. She was wrong to assume that he had been trying to be nice to her. Joseph was delivering a service to his customers. She was a customer, one that he went extra lengths to serve, and now he was protecting his team from stupidity by taking on this additional task himself. Let me know if I can help expedite a hire for you, Marie said. You know, I will, he said, now looking seriously. This will be a full-time job. I know, Marie said, shaking her head. Marie took out her phone and sent an email to herself to follow up on getting a hire for the kitchen to help out with stocking the soda. Then she smiled to herself. Now Joseph is my customer. She walked over to the open office area to catch Eric. Both Eric and Sheila were at their desks. Look what I found, Marie exclaimed proudly, putting the printed presentation in front of Eric, right on his keyboard. Eric looked up. Or, Marie clarified, it was actually Jason who found it. What did he find? Sheila asked curiously, standing up from her desk. The original onboarding deck that Natalie made, Marie said. Eric started leafing through it. Look at slide 4, Marie said. Eric found slide 4 and nodded. Natalie coined it, he said. Children's brains are not for commercial gain. I thought Jason had made that up, Sheila said. Now look at slide 5, Marie said. Eric turned the page. I present to you our core beliefs, Marie said triumphantly, aka the values of zebra apps. Well defined, but long forgotten. We have values? Sheila said, grabbing the page out of Eric's hand and accidentally brushing her box braids on his face. Now Eric also stood up and looked at the slide now in Sheila's hand. Now we have a starting point for our culture program, Eric said.
You're listening to Maneuvering Mondays, a podcast about transforming work culture. Tune in when we invite guests to comment on this part of Marie's journey. Thanks to Tiffany Lam, our wonderful speaker of the audiobook about Marie from Zebra Apps. What are your thoughts on Marie's situation? Have you had a similar experience? And what would you have done? Join the conversation on our LinkedIn page and let's maneuver Mondays together.